This is chapter 2, verses 39 and 40, which I recited previously, and their English translation is: permission to fight is given to those on whom war is made, because they are oppressed, and surely Allah is able to assist them. Those who are driven from their homes without a just cause, except that they say, "Our Lord is Allah," and if Allah did not repel some people by others, cloisters and churches and synagogues and mosques in which Allah's name is much remembered would have been pulled down, and surely Allah will help, him who helps him. Surely Allah is strong and mighty. We've been discussing the concept of just war because it's been 100 years since the First World War started. Now, there are 4 elements that we have to consider when we are looking at a conflict to decide whether it is a just war or not. The first one is the cause of that conflict. And the second one is how the conflict was conducted and when did it come to an end. And the third one is during the conflict and after, how were, for example, people who were taken as prisoners of war, they were treated. Now, the Islamic definition of when you are allowed to enter into a conflict is given here, and that is that those on whom war is made are allowed to fight. Those who are driven from their homes without a just cause are allowed to fight. If in your city or in your country you have some rebel group who's going around and killing people and so on, and you drive them out of your country into another country, then that is justified. But if you drive people out of their homes because you persecute them in such a way that they cannot bear the situation and the circumstances in their own country, then these are the people that are referred to here. Those who are driven from their homes without a just cause, except that they say, "Our Lord is Allah." Now, with that definition in mind, let us look at the First World War. People think that the First World War started in 1914. Well, yes, but its causes go back to 1870 and 71. It was at that time that we had the Franco-Prussian Wars, and it was at that time that Germany established itself as a power in Europe. Germans were well organized, they were modernizing, especially under Bismarck, whereas the French were in a disarray. And that was a cause for concern for the military establishment in Britain, because they felt it made the English Channel unsafe, which they regarded as their lake, and which made it unsafe for them to navigate to eastern lands. This was, of course, worsened by the fact that in 1908, it was, I think, that Austria annexed Bosnia. When I describe the background and the history of the First World War and mention places like Bosnia, Herzegovina, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Croatia, you will see that what happened then has continued in Europe to this day. Because the causes and things are still there. And it was quite interesting. Actually, there was one war in Europe between Serbia and Austria, I think it was. That was because Serbia tried to ban the import of pigs from one country to another. And then, of course, the whole situation was worsened in 1912 and 1913 by the Balkan Wars, in which Turkey was involved. So all of this conflict starting in 1870 and eventually culminating in 1914 in the First World War. What was the purpose of this conflict? Was it because people were being persecuted? Was it because the poor people didn't have any rights? Was it because people didn't have the right to vote? So what was the cause? If we look at the internal situation of any one of these countries, we know that persecution of ordinary man in Russia was so bad that it led to a civil war, it led to a revolution, and in the middle of the First World War, it led to the establishment of a communist government replacing the Russian monarchy. And at that point, Russians also pulled out of the First World War. We know that in Britain, working man did not have any rights. There were no employment laws, there was no minimum wage, there was no period of notice. If your employer didn't like you, whoever you were, he simply booted you out. Those of you who watched Upstairs, Downstairs, which was a romanticized version of how servants were treated, well, a better word for them might have been slaves were treated. That even in that household, they worked 7 days a week and something like 12 hours a day. They had to get up early in the morning and made sure that the house was warm for the master and his family before they got up. That the master and his family, when they got up, they had hot water. That when master and his family got up, they had clean clothes and a hot breakfast, and so on, the list goes on. So was the war to relieve the oppression of these people? We know that people didn't have the right to free speech. We know that people didn't have the right to act conscientiously. For example, what happened to conscientious objectors in the First World War? They were shot. They were treated as cowards because they could not see the reason for going out, suffering in trenches, killing Germans. As far as they were concerned, it was a fight between the British monarchy and military and the German monarchy and military and the Russian monarchy and military. For what purpose? To decide who was going to create their hegemony over Europe and to their colonies and empire in places like Africa and in Asia. You see, the last century and the century before developed a theory on which I have commented previously, and that was used by the British in the First World War, and that theory is called nationalism. You belong to a nation, and this theory is totally un-Islamic because God says mankind is one nation. Islam does not recognize English and French and German and Pakistanis and Saudi Arabians and Syrians and Japanese and Chinese as nations. Yes, for convenience that you inhabit certain parts and you can be recognized and differentiated as coming from those parts. Those labels may be used, but for no other reason, for nothing more. And we have seen the consequences of this nationalism in Balkans then, but later on in our own lifetimes, in Yugoslavia, Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia, all the killing and genocide and murder that has taken place has been due to this violation of the verse of the Holy Quran which says mankind is but a single nation. But then with nationalism, you had another problem, and that was that the European powers, all of them at the time, were imperial powers. Britain had its colonies, Germany had an empire, French had an empire, the Dutch had an empire, and so the list goes on. And they wanted to protect their colonies and their national and economic interest in getting to and from those colonies, getting materials from those colonies. As we know, when Dutch wanted to develop Suriname, a mostly uninhabited part of South America, they took bonded labor from Indonesia, from India. These people were tricked into going into Suriname and populating the country there. In all of this, humans and humanity and human rights, in all of this, humanity does not figure. None of these things are paramount in this. But together with the fact that you had nationalism, which was used, for example, to try and destroy the Turkish Empire and the Khilafat that they had established by telling Arabs that they were superior to the Turks. They should rise up in arms and rebel and throw the Turks out. And this one large country that was inhabited by people was divided up into small, even tiny states which could be easily manipulated by the powers that be at that time. But together with that, we had a military theory which is still current. See, if you read this verse of the Holy Quran, it says, verse 39, permission to fight is given to those on whom war is made. But this military theory, this military strategy that became current just before the First World War was this: you attack first. Take your enemy by surprise. Don't let them get ready to fight you, and you will win. So the result was that when there would be a disagreement, when there was a problem, countries would start mobilizing. Well before the First World War, Britain mobilized, Germany mobilized, Russia mobilized. The result of that was that the smallest incident could lead to a terrifying war, as it did. The Archduke Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie, I think her name was, well, first name was, they were killed by a revolutionary, and that led to this war. And when I tell you later on, perhaps next week, the number of people who died in this conflict, you will be staggered. You would be hard put to believe that human beings are capable of such butchery and such inhumanity and killing on such a vast scale. And as I said, some didn't want to go. Those who went and saw this and didn't want to be a part of it because they could see no just cause. They could see two imperial powers, two blocks of imperial powers, trying to destroy each other. For what reason? For territory, for more power. And they could not see. The man in the street could not see what benefit he would get out of it. He could see what benefit the generals and the businessmen and the like would get out of it, but what would he get out of it? He could not see. And for exercising the call of his conscience, he was court-martialed and he was shot. You see, apart from the cause, which determines whether a war is just or not, you also have the result. What happened after that? Well, first of all, we had this joke which said it will be over by Christmas. It started on, when was it? Was it 14th of July or something, 1914. And people were told they'll be home for Christmas. Well, they weren't home for Christmas. They weren't home for many Christmases. And in millions, they didn't come back home at all. And I find it sad that now, as then, war was glorified. This is not the stand that Islam takes. Islam does not glorify war. If Islam glorifies anything, it's individual sacrifice that people make in a cause. God says in the Holy Quran to the Holy Prophet that I have allowed Muslims to fight, although you do not like violence. But in another place, the Holy Quran also says that sometimes persecution, if allowed to continue, is worse than the killing that will take place to stop that persecution. These khutbahs that I am giving, which eventually will lead to the conclusion that the First World War was an unjust war, as defined by Islam, are not meant to belittle or ridicule those who gave their lives or who returned home invalided and maimed because they fought for the realm, because they fought for their country, regardless of what that country was, whether it was Russia, whether it was Germany, whether it was France, whether it was Britain, whichever country it was. This series of khutbas is meant to honor the soldier who went out to fight. But they sacrifice, they laying down their lives for the sake of politicians and military men, as is happening now the world over, did not make the war itself a just war. Whereas we salute them, we should also look at the conduct of the politicians and the generals who sometimes sacrificed up to 100,000 men to advance their troops half a mile. So the causes, as I said, of the First World War were not just causes. It was nationalism, it was militarism, and it was imperialism. And none of these things have any place in Islam. So as far as causes are concerned, it was not a just war. And we'll continue and we'll look at how the war was conducted and when it ended and the fruit of that war. What did the world, what did Europe get out of the killing of millions and millions of not only its own soldiers? Remember, people came from the United States and Canada and Australia and New Zealand and what are now India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal and Ceylon. All of them came over and they perished in the mud fields of France, and they lie there without anyone even having said their funeral prayers.